Welcome everybody to another edition of African Liberty webinar. Uh, Today, or this month rather, we're going to be discussing a much more familiar topic for many of our audience, which is free market or state-controlled economy implications for small businesses. First, my name is Ibrahim Anoba, and I'm the editor of African Liberty. And with me today to help us make sense of this question are first Nicholas Woode-Smith, who writes for the Free Market Foundation and is a council member of the Institute of World Relations in South Africa. Woode-Smith is an economic historian, political analyst, and fiction author. He has written hundreds of articles on South Africa, its politics, economics, and history. Nicholas Woode-Smith is the managing editor and co-editor or co-founder of the Rational Standard. He holds a B.Sci. in philosophy and economic history from the University of Cape Town. Welcome, Nicholas.
Thanks for having me.
And of course, Lipton Matthews, who is a researcher, business analyst, and writer. His writings has been published in the Federalist, Merino West Intellectual Takeout, African American Thinker, and the Mises Institute, and many others. His YouTube channel, with over 2,000 subscribers, engages intellectuals and experts to discuss issues around market economy, politics, history, policies in Africa and beyond. As you guys already know, this platform is an open space for people with different interpretations of open market from the whole spectrum. So we don't limit our engagement to a specific sets of interpretation of how the market should function or whatnot, which is why we often have people with diverse views about the markets or the economy. So I guess to first of all start off, I was looking at the most recent Wall Street Journal ranking of countries that have the easiest environment for doing business. And as you guys know, only Mauritius comes close in the top 25. In fact, Mauritius is the 25th ranked country for doing business. And after Mauritius, the only African country you will find, fortunately, is Rwanda, which ranks at 41. And totally just those two countries are in the top 50. So this makes it a problem because, as we know, a strong contingent of the global economy is focused in Africa. As a matter of fact, a lot of the raw materials used for manufacturing across the West or the global North are extracted from Africa. Africa has a huge population of young people, which of course in any way is always dominating the labor force. But this is a problem because the majority of these African countries are not so favorable in terms of doing business. So I'm thinking you can start us off, Nicholas. What do you think is responsible for this low ranking on the Ease of Doing Business Index?
Simply bad institutions and bad ideology. So we have all these resources that you've mentioned. We've got the people, we've got the valuable resources and raw materials, but because of ideologies of the past, communism, African socialism, nationalism, and even colonialism back in the day, and with the ideologies that spawned from that, we haven't been able to create the correct institutions to harness these resources. And so instead of creating an entrepreneurial spirit that can lead to creating businesses that can then turn people into workers and skilled workers into professionals, the government basically just combines everything around extractionary industries such as mining, where they can just take wealth without having to worry about their potential political rivals gaining power or gaining any sort of economic relevancy. And the main fault of this is ideology, and that ideology then leads to a lack of institutions. So now I think that the ideologies have become so ingrained that most of the time people don't even know why are we acting this way in a lot of these countries. In South Africa, for instance, the ANC comes from a communist background, but today it's not even thought. A lot of ANC members won't even understand that they are acting in a way that follows Karl Marx. They just believe this is the right way of doing things, but it's not. We've got policies that discourage people from being employed, like extremely stringent labor laws that actively discourage businesses from employing people. We've got minimum wage that continually rises when most people can't even get a job for under the minimum wage. We've got laws that just continually make it harder and harder to do business, how to make it harder to even get remittances. So if people find a job overseas, it makes it almost impossible for them to bring the money back from overseas. And all these policies are all brought in because there's this ideology of control. And this control is, at the end of the day, I think the main overarching ideology of communism, authoritarianism, everything, is that the people at the top, the government, but in essence, just formalized warlords, just want to make sure that they're going to be the big boss and that no one else is going to be able to topple them. And it's that fear that someone can topple them that stops them from creating institutions that can enable people to get rich, because that richness can be used to buy guns that can then be used to have a coup to overthrow them. But we need to allow people to make money so they can feed their families and grow, and that this continent can be where in its rightful place at the top, because we do have all the resources.
Correct. Lipton, do you agree that the problem has provenance in ideological constructs of economic alternatives, like, okay, because African governments have been implementing the so-called leftist or left-wing policies, communism or whatnot, as Nicholas put it, do you think this is the sole responsible factor for our low ranking on the business index?
Ideology is important, and for several reasons. So today, I would imagine that we're going to have a policy discussion, but ideology is crucial. Africans are collectivistic. Individualistic countries are more likely to innovate. Individualistic countries have better institutions, and individualistic countries are also less corrupt. Because Africans are more likely to be collectivistic, there is actually support for government intervention and regulation. So I'm a Jamaican of African descent, and in Jamaica, people lobby for regulations. In Nigeria, there are business people who will advise the government to implement regulations when sometimes these regulations are not needed, but players advocate regulations to make it harder for other people to compete. So ideology is significant. We cannot discuss policy in Africa without talking about ideology and the role of market economies. Let me give a perfect example. In America, one can promote laws to make it easier for civil servants to innovate, because in America, the state is actually the enemy of progress. Both liberals and conservatives are critical of the state. The state is an engine that should allow individuals to be successful. But in developing countries in Africa, tax burden as a percentage of GDP is actually lower than Western countries. Because tax burden as a percentage of GDP is lower, the state is often engaged in activities to extract resources from the population. So there's a conflict between bureaucrats and entrepreneurs. So that's a major problem in Africa. So in Africa, if you're an exporter, to export a product, one would have to comply with several regulations. You're complying with global regulations, and you're also complying with African regulations. And some of the African regulations are not necessarily related to sanitary measures or even environmental measures. They exist for the sake of existing, and they allow government agencies to reap financial rewards. So government agencies, they must assist the government to increase tax revenues, because it's difficult to collect taxes in Africa and other developing regions because of low levels of informality. Informality is relatively high due to low levels of human capital, and it doesn't make sense to tax an informal business because many of these businesses are not competitive. So in a situation where institutions are weak and human capital is low, entrepreneurs are overtaxed. It's easier to extract resources from entrepreneurs. So instead of enabling free markets where one can create a business without complying with a web of complicated regulations, it's more convenient for the state to impose taxes on entrepreneurs, because that's one way to fund the state. There's a growing conflict between bureaucrats and entrepreneurs. And back to our earlier point about ideology, countries like Mauritius and Botswana, they have done better than other countries in Africa due to free market ideology. So Botswana and Mauritius elected leaders who were more receptive to free market ideologies, and Botswana and Mauritius also place a premium on building quality institutions to improve governance and quality bureaucracies. Bureaucracies are also crucial to growth. A bureaucracy should be efficient. A bureaucracy cannot afford to be tribal, and tribalism is still a major problem in many areas in the developing world. So Botswana and Mauritius invested in employing quality civil servants to staff government bureaucracies. Civil servants are basically managing the economy, because let's be realistic, we're not going to get rid of the state anytime soon. So the civil servant must be highly educated, competent, and receptive to free market ideology. So Singapore is a classic example. Some argue that Lee Kuan Yew was authoritarian. Yes, he was authoritarian, but in Singapore, civil servants were highly educated and highly paid because we wanted to attract the best people in order to retain investment. So countries in Africa like Nigeria are adept at attracting foreign investment according to the World Investment Report, but they're inept at sustaining long-term economic growth and investment. Investors want institutions, human capital, and an easy business environment, because entrepreneurs generally like to take risk, even if the environment is not conducive to growth, they're still going to go to Nigeria because entrepreneurs take risks. But if you want them to spend 20 or 30 years in Nigeria, we have to create an environment that's conducive to economic growth and development.
All right, before I ask you this question, I want to inform everybody that if you have questions, please drop them in the chat box or the chat function, and we'll be sure to answer them. It's interesting that you mentioned Lee Kuan Yew and Singapore, Lipton. The reason is because the closest country to Mauritius is actually Rwanda. And a lot of people have argued that Rwanda is not your typical democracy. In fact, Rwanda is contravening to whatever norms you have about democracy. This idea of periodic elections or periodic changing or rotation of the parliamentarians. And as we know, Rwanda's president has been there for a while. I mean, he's shown some tendencies you can refer to as authoritarian. However, the economy seems to be very flourishing under Paul Kagame. Nicholas, how do you then reconcile this existence of Rwanda when you argue that we need a so-called not dictatorial, not authoritarian presidents or leaders to make the economy work?
So the main reason that the ideology that's behind anti-free market sympathies in Africa is because they don't want someone to overthrow them. Because if you have like a growing middle class, the growing middle class can buy guns and overthrow you. Rwanda, I believe, the president has taken, drunk the free market Kool-Aid. Now, the Kool-Aid is not poison in the sense, and he does truly believe in this is how you make a successful country. So I do actually think he is sincere. I think he's one of those rare statesmen who actually does believe, okay, I want my country to be successful, and this is how I'm going to make it successful. I am skeptical about Rwanda, not from a sense of thinking that they're lying or that they're being deceitful. I don't think that. I think that what we're seeing is true. I just do believe that Singapore succeeded for many more reasons than just Lee Kuan Yew's authoritarianism and his general. He was a political genius in many ways. He's on the same caliber as Bismarck. But the fact that it's on one of the most major trade routes in the world, the fact that it was a crossroads between so many economic powers and really put it leagues above other people. I do think that Singapore could have effectively been slightly, not as successful as it is now, but slightly successful even if it had worse policies. But I think that the big thing here is that there's a difference between political freedom and economic freedom. In order to gain economic freedom, you can have it while lacking political freedom. So we had monarchies in the past where you'd have no chance of ever being elected a leader because you have a king in charge, but the king would still say, hey, you can go and start a business. At the same time, though, I don't think that you can have true political freedom without economic freedom. And we see that in Africa today, that you have plenty of countries which on paper are democracies, but because the people are effectively still a peasant class that aren't allowed to own property, or aren't able to own property, and aren't able to have a gainful employment where they can produce skills and have economic independence, they're effectively going to be serfs to politicians who are going to use them for their to their own ends. When in Rwanda, it's I wouldn't call it a full-on dictatorship, especially in Africa. There's plenty worse, in my opinion. But it is on the authoritarian side of the spectrum. But because it is enabling a degree of freedom, as long as it sustains that, and that's the crucial thing that Lipton actually mentioned, it needs to be sustainable. They can have these short-term gains, but if a civil service isn't ingrained with an ideology of being pro-free market, gains made in one generation can just collapse. And that's why that's the main reason why I'm skeptical about Rwanda, is this is all based around the one individual who's the president. And I'm not sure yet if there's enough of political culture in Rwanda that once he dies or gets overthrown or people just get bored of him, that it won't just pull back to what it previously was, a country which was capable of committing an extremely devastating genocide. But at the same time, there's been many other countries which have also committed genocides, which have then managed to recover and learn from their mistakes. But that remains to be seen, and I think we're only going to start seeing who's right a few decades from now.
Okay, Lipton, so stemming from your point of view to Paul Kagame in Rwanda, and to an individual like Xi Jinping in China, where people have said, we have, individuals who make their country open to trade, in some sense, free market system. However, that free market, it's often managed with certain degree of state intervention. And this is what has been responsible for not only Singapore's, but Rwanda's, but also China's ascendancy as global strong powers, that you can't just have free markets as a blanket policy without some form of strong state mind that can regulate, or institutions that can regulate. So what is your answer to this kind of suggestions, Lipton?
Well, the typical classical liberal response is that little is needed for states to advance. So even those who are skeptical of the state argue that we need a proper constitution that permits markets, because the rule of law can exist independent of the state, but as long as the state exists, the rule of law provides some fodder for market activity. So a constitution can neither promote economic development or impede economic development. So I'm not arguing that the state is necessary for economic growth, but it can help entrepreneurs to facilitate economic growth. Back to the question of Rwanda and authoritarianism in China. I'm sorry to affect the bubble in which some people live, but the truth is that economic freedom promotes economic growth, and economic growth lifts people out of poverty. Economic freedom is even a better predictor of economic growth than good governance. So I'm not surprised that Rwanda is doing well, because for countries to grow, we need economic freedom. Political freedom can positively affect growth. Political freedom is better than authoritarianism, but many authoritarian states have produced economic growth. So there's a growing literature in economic research where people argue that China is an authoritarian state and the economy has grown because what we really need is for an authoritarian leader to respect the free market and invest in his commitment to entrepreneurs. So even the economy, even the IMF will tell you that China recorded spouts of growth because of free market ideologies and promoting market. So the Chinese state in the late 70s and the 80s made it easier for entrepreneurs to participate in the market economy. Licenses were still required, but they were reduced to some extent. So what we really need is for a government to remain committed to the market. So democracy is not bad, but democracy is not a necessary or even sufficient condition for economic growth. So some persons are saying Rwanda could become a dictatorship, and if Rwanda becomes a dictatorship, then economic growth may just demise in Rwanda. No, that's not the case. This is not what we know from history. This is not what we learned from China. The problem with a country like China is that for China to become truly innovative, the Chinese state should make it easier for companies to become radical. So even today in China, the Chinese state and its bureaucrats are still watching entrepreneurs. It's not unusual for a company to have a sleeper cell of bureaucrats who are basically monitoring the entrepreneur. The Chinese state can only outcompete America by becoming radically innovative. Many people may not be aware of this, but China has an IP deficit with America, not a surplus. Most of the major technologies are still invented in Western countries. So some time ago, I was speaking to Diego Comin, and he said, well, people talk about China, but the big innovators are not in China. So even today, some are still shocked that despite Chinese high growth levels, it is still not as innovative as the West. Yes, the Chinese are investing in science and technology, but many of the engineers who are employed in China and India would be unfit to work in Western countries. You only get Western levels of growth by promoting radical individualism. And this is where political freedom comes into play. Political freedom is a form of economic and social creativity. So when we toy with political ideas, these ideas can positively impact economic growth. So anti-mercantilism during the Enlightenment era was actually a political idea more than an economic idea, but it had economic implications. So when we say that we want free speech in China, that's also the freedom for entrepreneurs to create and innovate, because that's a form of speech. Entrepreneurial activity is a form of expression because ideas emerge in the mind. So economics is speech. So the political freedom that China needs is not political freedom proper per se, but creative freedom that will then translate into political freedom.
Okay, so a lot of people who actually subscribe to the idea of free market, they've argued a lot about the fact that the politically stable or the politically free countries often tended to be the most economically prosperous. Like if you have political freedom, economic prosperity often tend to come along the same way. However, the emergence of Rwanda in Africa and China in Asia as kind of like making that conclusion to be kind of shaky. And if a lot of people have also argued that economic progress depends on stability. And we've seen in Africa particularly that frequent changing of government often shake up the economy in such a way that it could become negative. And China and Rwanda have been able to maintain economic progress because they've been able to have stability economically because there is a stability in their politics. So that's another argument that people often use to contravene free market promoters. So before we move to the next segment, I just want to give you guys, each of you, 1 minute to respond to that. Do you need political stability to have economic stability, which will bring about economic progress, or political stability doesn't have to exist before economic progress can exist? Nicholas, 1 minute.
So the two most successful countries in the past, the United Kingdom and the United States, were democracies with frequent changes of government, and they grew far faster than China did. China is also currently going through a huge collapse because of centrally planned policies. So for all of its lip service, their pay to free market policies, it hasn't been enough because of the dominant control of the Communist Party has led to unsustainable growth in bad industries because they did not have the free market to guide them. That's why they're having a housing bubble burst. That's why they're having a population crisis. And I think that we're not going to see the PRC in the next few decades because it's going to end up collapsing and being replaced by something else.
Okay, that's a huge prediction. Lipton.
Interesting prediction indeed. But again, as I will argue, authoritarian states are usually stable over the long term, and in order for countries to succeed, leaders must maintain credible commitments to economic reforms, and several studies have demonstrated that authoritarian leaders have managed to remain committed to economic reforms. So China is a different case from Rwanda. History teaches us that the Chinese are quite adept at managing change and suppressing revolt. So maybe in the next 10 or even 20 years, the Communist Party in China will still be powerful because the Chinese are quite adept at managing change. As for African countries, in particularly Rwanda, Rwanda needs Schumpeterian growth to achieve Western levels of development. And because we want Rwanda to accelerate economic progress, presently at this time, Rwanda requires a leader with political and social capital who is able to mobilize these people to grow the economy. And this person for the moment is Paul Kagame. He may be authoritarian, but he's committed to economic freedom. So I am not going to bash Kagame for being an authoritarian, because at the present moment, maybe that's what Rwanda needs, a leader who is willing to maintain credible commitments to economic freedom.
Okay, interesting. It's a lot of radical views on this webinar, but again, that's why we have an area of views. So I want us to switch gears and try to contend with the role of small businesses in all of this. I mean, particularly Africa south of the Sahara, a lot of our economies depend hugely on the informal economy, or the informal sector, which is driven by small businesses. I mean, individual proprietors. I mean, my mom, the whole of my family have always, been sole proprietors, and that's why we're able to go to school. But a lot of people, in fact, in the so-called free market spectrum, have often, in fact, of lately, join a lot of people on the other side of the spectrum to argue for some form of, I don't want to use the word protection, but for some of policies to exist to protect I'm using the word protect again, but to sort of shield the SMEs in Africa from the obviously corrupt advances of many multinational corporations. I mean, very unfair economic maneuverings. I'm not talking about just general businesses as usual. I mean, I'm talking about instances where bigger corporations will go into some places on Lagos Island and pay local boys or thugs to make sure the small businesses are not selling the same thing as they are selling. I mean, a lot of we've seen examples in the shoe markets or the Chinese clothes markets. So a lot of people are arguing that in some way, even if we do not like regulation, the state needs to shield the small businesses in Africa from these corrupt practices by the larger corporations or the mid-sized corporations. But also, we know that as free market proponents, that when you call for regulation, it's often leading to bad cases when government will use that to regulate a lot of things, and of course, make the economy go crazy. So, what are your views in terms of regulation, particularly considering the fact that the African economy is driven by small businesses, which are in many cases suffering from the corrupt practices of the larger businesses? I think we should go first, Nicholas.
So the problem with protectionism, and I think I will call it that because I think that's generally what we're referring to, is protecting local businesses from foreign businesses, corrupt or not. Now, firstly, if the multinationals being corrupt and breaking the law, I think it's better to actually enforce existing laws than to pass new regulations. Of course, if those laws actually make sense. Like, for example, if they're going up and they're like stealing people's land, that's blatantly unethical, blatantly illegal. Stops them from doing that. But if their so-called corrupt crime is that they're providing cheaper alternatives to local businesses, that's not really a crime. I think the big problem with discussing protectionism and, what we call in South Africa local is lekker, is that we forget that small businesses and local businessmen aren't the only people that we're trying to help here. There's also consumers. There's also other industries. In South Africa, they've tried to put tariffs and protection and regulations to stop the imports of steel because they want to protect our local steel industry. As a result, a lot of manufacturers who need steel are unable to get steel at cheap and affordable prices, and it's caused a shortage because they're not allowed to buy it. Where it's also affected non-businesses in that that there was years ago, there was protection to stop us from buying poultry and chicken from Brazil, which was selling it to us very cheaply, and because they wanted to support local farmers. As a result, food prices skyrocketed, and that affected normal consumers on the ground. So my problem with protectionism is that even if it's basically favoring one business over the other, and the person who is suffering the most is the consumer at the end of the day. I believe the free market is global. I don't believe that you can actually localize it. And I believe that when you do localize it, you are losing out on its greatest benefits, which is the competition drives innovation. Competition drives the incentive to do better. And it also rewards doing as good as you can and punishes people who are growing slack or lazy. This is why governments tend to grow slack and lazy, is because they lack competition. But free market businesses, they get active and they innovate and they perform well because they know that if they don't, someone else, a new kid on the block, can just push them out. Now, the problem here with small businesses versus multinationals is a case of scale. Now, this is and this is the problem where I'm going to have to be maybe a little bit unpopular. Small businesses, there's like a romantic idea that we like our small businesses, and especially I'm a small business owner, my father is as well, and that the idea of a big multinational who can outbid us, you can spend more than us, come ushering in and pushing us off the block, it's not nice. But at the same time, if let's say I own a coffee shop, and with my scale of my enterprise and with the quality of my products, I'm going to sell a subpar cup of coffee for $20, for 20 Rand. But Starbucks comes in and it says, well, I can sell a globally approved, everyone around the world loves this coffee. We got beans from all around the world, and I'm going to sell it for half the price because I've got the scale to produce it. Yes, my business might go under, but it would be going under because consumers prefer the alternatives. And that's the thing at the end of the day, is that consumers are going to decide which product is better. Now, this is talking about the legal confines of the free market. Now, most of the time you actually find that the reason that big companies end up being able to stomp on small businesses is because the regulations benefit the big businesses, and that they tend to be, and the regulations tend to crush small businesses. You can't afford new minimum wage laws. You can't afford all the paperwork and the bribes and everything like that. And small businesses who are the ones who aren't resilient enough to resist them. So I believe that protectionism is something that is too dangerous to really play around with. And I think the only time we should ever really consider it is not as an economic policy, but as a geopolitical policy in the case of war, like sanctions. That's the only time I really actually am pro any form of protections.
Right, I'm going to ask you the same question, Lipton, but in another dimension. A lot of arguments have been made that you look at Japan, China, in fact, Rwanda, that a lot of these countries, in fact, Singapore as well, a lot of these countries, the primary drivers of their economy towards prosperity were locally owned companies. Even though you may have Apple and whatnot, the primary drivers of the economy have been the local companies. So people have said you cannot have economic prosperity at the level of China, Singapore, Rwanda, unless you harness your local producers. So if Nicholas is saying we cannot or we should not protect the local producers by enforcing protectionist policies, what should be the alternative, if at all you think that should be an alternative, Lipton?
Ibrahim, that questions, for those who pose it seriously, sounds prudent, but it's actually quite unwise. Japan and other countries in Asia, their economies grew because of export-oriented growth. The recent literature has actually shown that even without industrial policies, these countries would have recorded growth. Saying that America and England invested in industrial policy does not mean that countries will get rich if they invest in industrial policy. America, England, Japan, and other countries became quite wealthy for several reasons. Japan again. Growth in Japan was driven by homegrown firms. So what? During the Industrial Revolution in Europe, financing to fund industries actually came from the domestic market. And some argue that in the Industrial Revolution did not produce rapid growth in England due to a paucity of financial institutions. When countries are about to take off, they need to build high quality local companies. And these companies do not need to be protected. So one cannot truly argue that rich countries became rich because their economies were grown by local companies that were protected. No, that's not a serious argument. Today in economies, it's actually posited that in countries like Japan and South Korea, traditional firms are dominating the economy and they're protected. And these countries will achieve higher levels of growth when the economy becomes more productive and allows these traditional firms to just experience their demise or wither away. So that's actually a bad argument to promote protectionism on the basis that rich countries became rich because local industries were homegrown and protected. Not true in all cases. There are many examples of protectionism actually undermining economic growth. Just like railroads, railroads were important, but as Robert Fogel reminds us, even without railroads, the American economy would have grown anyway. Now to the issue of small businesses. I will be bursting bubbles, but small businesses are not the engine of growth. In the UK, 6% of high growth firms account for 50% of employment growth. The relationship between opportunity driven entrepreneurship and growth is positive, but there's a negative relationship between necessity-driven entrepreneurship and economic growth. Developing countries have high rates of necessity-driven entrepreneurship, and the relationship between entrepreneurship and economic growth in the developing world is negative because many of these entrepreneurs are really hustlers. The entrepreneurs that succeed, the gazelles, they go on to become the high performers that create employment and innovate. So if we're serious about economic growth, we should facilitate businesses. We should not be protecting SMEs because the average SME is unproductive and must be allowed to fail. So entrepreneurs in Nigeria complain about regulations. If entrepreneurs are attacking insensible regulations, then the government should do away with such regulations to make it easier for people to invest, start businesses, and create prosperous economies. Genuflecting to small businesses will just create another category of rent seekers. It's not a sensible policy.
All right. Before we switch gears, I just want to make you guys make a strong point, but to make some things also known. In fact, yeah, the British Industrial Revolution was driven by the local economy, and of course in America we also know that a lot of the advances in the economy that happened during the Industrial Revolution was also driven by local producers, even if it's intertwined with slavery and whatnot. And of course, Japan, a lot of the companies in Japan that become so multinational now, Honda, Kia, Samsung, were locally home. Anyway, but before we switch gears, I'm asking these questions because I know a lot of people on this forum who will watch this video later on are already fans of free market. However, these are questions that people ask when you go debate. And that's why I'm posing this question. So one of those other questions will be that we've seen the fact that free market has been partially responsible for the great advancement in the global economy from the Industrial Revolution upward. And of course, it has its own flaws, historical flaws, again, slavery, exploitation of the working class and whatnot. But we cannot deny the fact that it is responsible for the tremendous global economic development. So people are now saying that is the free market a ticking time bomb? That we've seen flashes during the global financial crisis in 2008. We've seen, in fact, bigger flash during the Great Depression. That things could just be going downward spiral, that you are operating on an economic system that is, of course, making some people rich and a huge significant number of people across the world are poor, which of course can be a very tricky argument. However, how do you guys respond to this? First, Nicholas.
So first, I just want to quickly just add something to Lipton's great great explanation before your question. Just to add something to Japan. Japan's had protectionism, but very interestingly, its protectionism benefited two industries, steel and chemicals. And the industries that they actually punished, because they did more than just protectionism, they also would literally ban industries from and ration them from buying certain resources, because it was a post-war economy. So they would make it that certain businesses couldn't get enough funding or buy resources and supplies that they needed. And the two industries that they targeted, because they thought that these industries would be unproductive, were cars and small electronics. Literally the industries that Japan's now known for were actually sabotaged by government regulators. But they were so good at what they did that they ended up making Japan rich, while the industries that the government were protecting collapsed. Okay, but to answer the question, so first, the free market doesn't make some people rich and other people poor. The free market doesn't make anyone, at least en masse, poor. In countries where people have talked about, the rich becoming richer and the poor becoming poorer, the actual truth that the data has been showing is that the rich get richer at a way higher pace, because that's how interest works, that's how exponential growth works. But the poor have also, on average, been getting richer. And it's not only in terms of data and numerical wealth. And a lot of people have fallen into this trap of saying, okay, look my bank account, I have this much money, and that just represents wealth. They forget that our access to certain resources, to services, to products, the average person today, the average lower middle class person in most modern places today, especially, let's go to the West, particularly the capitalist West, the average lower middle class worker has more products and wealth at their disposal than an emperor of China, of the British Empire, of the Spanish Empire, of any of these great empires 400 years ago. The Industrial Revolution opened up the world to so many wonderful technologies, to products. We can have things from around the world. And I'm sure we're all familiar with the iPencil essay of how it takes so many infinite amounts of processes to create a simple product. But can you imagine if we didn't have access to the markets around the world and the transport necessary to get it to and fro, we wouldn't be able to have something as simple as a pencil. We wouldn't have be able to wear the clothes that we're wearing right now. All the clothes that we're all wearing here take up technology and materials from all around the world. And it's the free market that enables that. I do not think the free market is a ticking time bomb, because I think the free market is absolutely natural. And I think that governments, warlords, revolutionaries will constantly try to break the system. They'll try to play God. They will try to destroy nature and become their own deities, but it always pull back. And I believe that that's why it's not going to blow up, because the world would have to blow up for it to blow up. And the free market will not be responsible for that.
All right, a great response. Lipton, you want to respond to the same question, the idea of a
Ibrahim and Nicholas, economic freedom promotes social mobility and income equality. I didn't say income inequality, income equality. Economic freedom makes it easier for ordinary people to accumulate wealth. Socialism promotes inequality because the socialist bureaucracy is responsible for enriching entrepreneurs who are involved in the socialist economy. So market economies can result in inequality, but economic freedom is more likely to equalize income than socialism. And we have papers as early as 2020 and 2021 teaching us that market economies are better to promote the equalization of income. It might sound a bit weird, but that's just the truth. Secondly, working class people in America and other rich countries are better off than upper class people in poor countries, because Western economies are so rich. And because the world economy is so fabulously wealthy, ordinary people today are richer than the elites of the past. Furthermore, when we're measuring income inequality, we need to compare the incomes of poor people to their living expenses and their consumption patterns. And again, research is showing that when we look at consumption patterns, poor people are doing excellent relative to their income. So some opine that we ought to look at the personal consumption expenditure PCE. We should look at PCE to gauge income inequality rather than the consumer price index, because the personal consumption expenditure is actually a direct assessment of how people are living. In an economy, prices can go up, they can go down, and they can go down. So the CPI might not be the best deflator to assess income inequality and living standards. And back to the free market being a ticking time bomb. The policies of FDR delayed economic recovery by 7 years, and the financial recession of 2008 was abetted by the government. The government made it the norm for uncompetitive people to secure loans and participate in activities that they did not have the resources to sponsor. So free markets can fail. Market failure does not justify does not justify government intervention. When markets fail, we learn what can work and what will not work, and we're also exposed to new innovation. So market failure is not an excuse to justify government intervention. And usually when markets fail, it's due to government policies rather than the free market, because bureaucrats don't know how to properly allocate resources because their incentives are different from economic incentives. Political incentives are sentimental incentives. In a real market economy, successful businesses will thrive and uncompetitive businesses will fail. So market entrepreneurs are not sentimental. They cannot afford to be sentimental. They have to respond directly to the price or just come out of business. And government policy is responsible for maintaining inefficient state-owned enterprises, and such is the case in China. So again, the free market doesn't have to be perfect for it to be the most perfect economic arrangement. And when market fails, this does not justify government intervention.
All right, before we switch gear to the last phase of the webinar, about politics and the environment. I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned the 2008 financial crisis, which, I mean, a lot of the literature, in fact, investigation, that point to the house and mortgage companies and how their overreach was also in a great way a factor that triggered that crisis, even though the Obama government was really problematic in its response to the crisis. Okay, but about the political aspect of the free market now, a lot of people will look at the post-2015 world and how Facebook, Twitter, primarily, where they became chambers of misinformation, disinformation, forums for the promotion of political elements that promote political instability. We know about how Russia tried to influence it, or indeed influence it, and sort of change the course of the US election. But we also see the same thing happening across Africa, where these social media forums are becoming hotbeds for promotion of elements that foster political instability. And people will point to the free market. That is because you asked that guys like Zuckerberg or Jack, whatever he was, to be operating these forums in free in a free way without controlling them or regulating them. It's the reason why we have the social media existing as political hotbed for extremism. So first of all, Nicholas, what would be your response to that?
So there's two things. No one said that freedom was going to be easy, but it's still worth it. The alternative is that no one's allowed to speak, that good ideas will be held back. Before people had access to media, when the media was just something, and in countries where the media is controlled by the government, they tend to be static, they tend to be poor, actually. And Russia might be really big on a map, but its people are incredibly poor, and it's got state-sponsored media that likes to just pretend that they're so super rich. And they don't, most of the Russian population don't even know that they're losing a devastating war at the moment. And that's information I think people should have. So while free speech can be used to say a lot of bad things, I still think it's worth the risk. Now, the second thing is quite interesting is that there's actually a government intervention in terms of the instability that's on the social media sites. There's a lot of evidence to show that the Russian government has actually been sponsoring bots, AIs, and people to effectively go onto these social media sites and foment chaos and instability. There was after there was the sanctions on the Russians, and they kind of shut down Russian IPs from accessing sites like Reddit and Twitter. A lot of these forums that were known as hotbeds for a lot of these conflicts actually ended up just dropping because they realized how many of the people who were pretending to be American partisans actually were Russian AIs. They weren't real people. They were pretending to do that in order to create chaos. Now, Max Brooks and Dan Carlin discussed this in a very interesting podcast called Asymmetrical Perspectives. Definitely look it up on Google, where Dan Carlin plays devil's advocate, and he says, okay, this is a reason why freedom of speech and social media are bad, because it opens up your country to foreign enemies, creating instability. Max Brooks says, no, yes, he's right. They do create an opening, but that opening is what makes us strong and makes us resilient. It's what makes us get used to this idea that we have to deal with people who disagree with us, and it makes us replace that idea of, I'm going to be right, and I'm not going to let anyone disagree with me, because we have to constantly engage them. We have to constantly get used to people who are different from us, because that's what the real world is like. When in countries which don't have that, when you're only exposed to one ideology, when you're exposed to a different ideology, you freak out. You don't know what to say. Either you're going to actually realize, wait, why do I believe in what I'm believing? Or you're just going to get really angry and violent. And I think it's better to live in a country where there's a capacity for instability and chaos, but we also have freedom and we have the ability to innovate and the ability to seek the truth than there is in a country or a situation where we don't have those avenues, where we believe one thing that we're being told to by an authority, and that could be the wrong thing.
Okay, I'm going to give you a chance to respond to that, Lipton, then I come to my final question.
Ibrahim, that argument is just so laughable. It's not difficult to ferret out misinformation from true information on social media. I was online once. There was a story. I clicked on the link. After clicking on the link, I discovered that the web page did not exist. So when people argue that Facebook is promoting misinformation, I don't want to do it, but I just have to say it. Well, according to researchers who subscribe to genetic explanation and environmental explanations, IQ scores are declining. So if people are getting dumber, then obviously they're going to become susceptible to fake news. This is really not that big of an issue. During the Cold War, the New York Times promoted misinformation, and even today, people have attacked the New York Times because of the 1619 Project. Legacy publications do engage in misinformation and disinformation. Regulating Facebook will not preclude the proliferation of misinformation and disinformation. And furthermore, if you are going to consume information, read credible sources like The Economist and the Wall Street Journal. And even when you're reading credible sources, always verify the information. If you opt to get your information from Facebook, you are a lazy person and you must face the consequences. It is not my problem that people are stupid and that they consume garbage on Facebook. I really don't care. Sorry.
Oh, well, I mean, it's real difficult because nowadays you really can't. Our life is so intertwined with social media, with Facebook and Twitter. Nowadays you get medical help from those platforms. We sell our businesses there.
But you have to verify it. You also have to verify the medical help.
That people need to take time to verify, and that verification is it's a really interesting process. As you said, people need just to commit time to find out the truth themselves, not to be lazy and just consume whatever information they want to consume. But I just want to say about the New York Times. Yeah, it's New York Times is as controversial as anything can be. I mean, you remember many of this media promoted the idea that Saddam Hussein had what they call mass destruction.
Weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah. But certain projects like 1619 are actually they could be so beneficial to the public in terms of reckoning with economic facts and whatnot. But lastly, we almost running out of time. I cannot but mention this other controversial question, which is about the climate change. That Exxon, Shell, and all those other corporations, Chevron of this world, these are your typical capitalists or capitalist corporations. And because we've allowed them to operate in free market environment, that's why they've damaged this environment so much that everybody across the world is now paying the price for it. And people are saying this is now the time to make radical change, particularly when it comes to corporations involved in oil or extraction that could have potential for climate. In 1 minute each, Nicholas, what's your response?
Historically and currently, countries which have more free market policies tend to actually produce less pollution and less contributions toward climate change. And secondly, I think that those radical changes that would be needed to stop climate change are the domain of the privileged. And I believe that I care much more about human welfare in the short term. I don't want people to die. And I think that a lot of these changes would result in a destructive of production that would result in a lot of poor people dying. So I'm not pro these reforms.
Yeah, I agree with some part of what you said, because again, we've seen a lot lately that African countries have been asked to tell their people to stop using gas to cook. So what should our people return to? Using firewood that would fry.
Firewood's also apparently a pollutant as well. So
many of those policies are actually not in the best interest of Africans, because we've been asking us to blanketly, unilaterally appreciate one solution, when in fact countries should address climate change based on how the economy is going to handle that. But again, we can disguise from the problem of climate change. And I want you to make your contribution.
Yeah, quick contribution. Historically, economic growth fizzled out due to energy shortages. Fossil fuels power economic growth, and they also power renewable energies. 100% reliance on renewables is insensible and just foolish. Furthermore, I don't endorse eco-imperialism. Rich countries invested in fossil fuels and coal to power their economies, so they do not have the moral authority to tell African countries to de-link from fossil fuels. The alternatives are really natural gas and nuclear, not renewables. And renewables also emit pollutants. And back to Nicholas' point, there's a positive relationship between environmental quality and income. Richer countries are less polluted, and the capitalist economies of the West were less polluted than the Soviet economies. So again, critics don't have a case.
In many cases, they do not have a case, because, as you said, a lot of these bigger powers, they developed on the back of fossil fuels. And now that Africa is trying to make its own development, you're asking us to stop using gas and whatnot. But I still think, as many, in fact, on this side of the spectrum will agree that climate change is a real problem, and we need to be very radical about how we approach it. However, each country must have their say according to their priorities. So on that note, I want to thank the two of you.